Hi there, Easter Bunny here again, and I have another wonderful story for you today about one of my relatives. This story is about Benjamin Bunny, one of my other cousins. I have cousins all over the place. But Benjamin Bunny lived near Mr. McGregor's farm. But he lived off to one side, and his cousin, another one of my cousins, Peter Rabbit, lived on the other side. And on this day, Benjamin Bunny, he was looking to get in trouble. He was kind of like Peter, and he always kind of did things that got him in a little bit of trouble. But Benjamin Bunny wanted somebody to go with him, so he went to find Peter, and he snuck around Mr. McGregor's house, and he went to his aunt's home where Peter lived, and he was trying to avoid his aunt because she knew that he was looking for trouble if she saw him. And luckily he came upon Peter Rabbit. But Peter Rabbit was sitting on a stump, wrapped in a cloth, shivering just a little bit and looking very sad. Benjamin Bunny walked up to Peter and said, "Peter, what's wrong?" And Peter just looked up with a sad face and said, "I lost my brand new blue jacket and my brand new shoes in Mr. McGregor's yard." Well, Benjamin Bunny said, "What are you sitting around here for? I just saw Mr. and Mrs. McGregor take off in their wagon down the road. They won't be back for hours. We can go get your clothes." Peter lightened up a little bit, but he was still really scared to go back to Mr. McGregor's after his last experience. But finally, Benjamin talked him into it, and the two boys walked down the path. And when they got to McGregor's, they climbed up a tree, and they looked all over the garden, and they spotted Peter's coat and his shoes hanging like a scarecrow in the middle of the garden. And one of Mr. McGregor's old hats was on top. It was all the way across the garden. And Peter just shook his head and said, "We'll never get it back." But before he could say anything else, Benjamin jumped over the wall and landed in the soft dirt. And Peter, of course, had to follow. So he jumped and landed right beside Benjamin. And they both started strolling through the garden. And Benjamin grabbed carrots and lettuce and anything else that he wanted to eat. Not a care in the world. But Peter kept looking over his shoulder. He kept looking around, trying to see if someone was going to chase him. But nothing did. So they walked right up to that scarecrow. Benjamin climbed up, took the jacket off, pulled the shoes off, and tossed them to Peter. And then he grabbed the big hat and put it on his head. But even with his floppy ears, it was too big. So he tossed the hat on the ground. Peter put his jacket back on, slipped his shoes back on, and for the first time, he actually felt a little happy. But as they started back across the garden, Peter kept hearing sounds, creaks. The wind would blow and Peter would jump. And as they came around a corner, laying right there in the middle of the trail to the gate, was a huge cat, one of Mr. McGregor's. The two boys dove underneath a basket and pulled it over their head to hide. Just as the cat woke up and stretched and yawned, and he started to walk over toward the basket, he sniffed it for a minute, and then he climbed up on top of the basket and laid down. Now inside the basket, Benjamin and Peter were scared to death. They were in the dark, and that cat slept on top of that basket for 5 I don't have fingers, but 5 hours. And they were getting desperate because Mr. McGregor would be home soon. And then they heard a whistle from the darkness. They couldn't see it, but old Mr. Benjamin Bunny, Benjamin's father, who was a fierce fighter, was walking along the wall of Mr. McGregor's, whistling with no care in the world. And the cat started to turn that way, but before he could do anything, old Benjamin Bunny jumped off the wall and landed on top of the cat. And the cat went and ran into the shed. And old Benjamin Bunny jumped up and threw the lock into the hole on the shed. And then he walked over and picked up the basket. And he looked down at his son and at his nephew. And he grabbed them both by the back of their coats. And after yelling at them for a few minutes, he walked them out of the yard and carried Peter home to his mother. And he held Peter up and he told him what trouble Peter had been in. And then he dropped Peter and he grabbed his son Benjamin and carried him home for some good punishment. And Peter's mother looked down at him. She was very disappointed that he'd gotten in trouble again. But then she noticed he had his new jacket on and his shoes. And she decided it was better not to ask too many questions. So she wasn't too hard on Peter. But back at old Mr. Bunny's, Benjamin went to bed with no supper. But you know who was the most curious? Mr. McGregor. When he got home that evening, he walked through his garden and he saw all these little feet print. He noticed his scarecrow was gone. And his cat had somehow managed to get itself locked inside a shed with a lock on the outside. Now, how in the world did that happen? Mr. Gregor would never, ever learn the answer to that question. And that is how Benjamin Bunny and Peter Rabbit managed to get his clothes back and not get into too much trouble. And I hope you've liked my story and have a happy day, and I'll tell some more later.